to more particular moral rules that he calls hypothetical imperatives. Do also recall near the end of the chapter, there's that discussion of Kant's notion of dignity, or Kant's dignity principle, which you'll also see this referred to as Kant's concept of what he calls the kingdom of ends. Now, what he means by this is such: always treat rational beings not as mere means, but as ends in themselves. Always treat rational beings not as mere means, but as ends in themselves. Now, this sounds excessively fancy, but conceptually it's really not fancy. To treat a person as a means is to treat someone else as a mere way to get to some particular ends. If we merely use people as a means to an end, this is akin to treating our fellow human beings as if they were what? This is akin to treating fellow human beings as if they were merely objects. Human beings are not mere objects. Because we are rational beings, according to Kant, we have this thing that is called dignity. Now, this word dignity is thrown around all over the place. What does dignity mean? If you had to put the word dignity into some other way of talking, how might you explain dignity to someone else? It's simple, but it might not be that easy to pinpoint. Beings that possess dignity have this. To say that someone has dignity is to say that she possesses this thing that we call intrinsic worth. Now, if that didn't clarify things for you, let me put it one more way. To have intrinsic worth means that you have value in and of yourself because you are the kind of being that you are. Not because of what you can do for other people, or not because of your utility value. You are valuable because you are a rational being. That's what Kant means by an end in itself. An end in itself means something that has value in and of itself. Not because of its utility purposes, but because of the kind of being that it is. And there is only one kind of being that Kant contends has this dignity. And that's what? Rational human beings. Now, indeed, if there were beings other than human beings that were also rational, guess what they would be? They would have dignity too. In other words, if there were creatures from another planet that showed up in Close Encounters of the Third Kind or something, and we found out that they had rationality on par with ours, we would have a rationale for treating them the same way that we would expect to be treated ourselves. And it's not because they look like us, it's because of their capacity for rationality. This is why, from a Kantian, 30 seconds, this is why from a Kantian perspective, Kant might not have liked this. But if we were scientifically to discover that dolphins were indeed highly rational beings, and that they could, and that they also do something like moral reasoning, we would have a good reason for treating them as if they were dignified beings too. Same way with, was it Noam Chomsky or Nim Chimpsky? That's the chimp that knew sign language, who had who could think things through and so forth. Yeah, Mr. Toberman.
If we were to discover something that would be more rational than us, would we be worth less than them through Kantian?
I'm glad Mr. Toberman asked that question. The answer is rationality is rationality. In other words, as long as a being is rational, that being has dignity. Now, here's the danger. How many of you like science fiction? I confess I'm a fan of science fiction. I'm also a big fan of bad science fiction. There was a TV series from the 1960s called The Outer Limits. They tried to do a modern remake of it, but it just wasn't as good as the campy special effects. Now, one of the episodes was titled The Sixth Finger. It was one of these evolutionary time machine scenarios where the guy was put into the evolutionary time machine and they evolved him to what human beings 100,000 years in the future would be like. Of course, he had the stereotypical giant head, giant bald head, pointed ears, and he had also evolved a sixth finger, I guess symbolizing more manual dexterity and so forth. Well, this guy, because he was hyper-rational, take a guess what he thought of mere humans. Yeah, he thought that they were worthless. And therefore he thought, well, what are they worth? And he had no problem using his mind powers to just zap them dead. Because he was like, oh, they're not as intelligent as me. Well, guess what? And I guess I'm going to make a distinction here that's not made in the textbook. Simply because a being might have higher intelligence doesn't mean that that being is necessarily more rational. All human beings that are relatively what Kant would call regular people have the capacity for rationality, even though some people have higher and lower intelligence quotients. It doesn't mean the person with the lower intelligence quotient is intrinsically less value with the person at genius level, because both are rational beings. Of course, the danger is that some people might equate rationality with high levels of intelligence, and as a result say, these people who are far less intelligent than me are subhuman compared to me. Therefore, they're just objects. Now, according to this reasoning, this character from the science fiction show I was talking about would not be abiding by Kantian principles. Because Kant would say all rational beings possess intrinsic worth, even if our intelligence levels might be relatively different from one another. Did I answer your question? Thank you. I appreciate that. Good question. Now, last time I talked about a couple of illustrations of Kant's theory, and I think this is worthwhile because the text doesn't entirely flesh this out, and I think it will also be nice because of way of contrast with utilitarians in the next chapter. In Kant's 4 illustrations, I'd already talked about the idea that he forbade suicide as ever being moral. This is where we left off last time. He says, no rational being could will promise breaking. Now, along with promise breaking would include things like lies are always wrong according to Kant. Take a guess what else is always wrong. Stealing would always be wrong, because each of these are forms of dishonesty. Now, folks, this might be a little bit of repeat from last time. Many of us are under the impression that lying isn't necessarily always immoral. Many of you might think that lies are morally permissible under what kind of stipulations?
High return, low consequence.
Yeah, in other words, let's say telling the truth would hurt somebody. Yeah, you hear what Mr. Peters said? He says, high return, low consequences. Suppose that your significant other went to the hairstylist and got a dye job that wasn't particularly good in your opinion. Now, instead of saying, your hair really didn't turn out that great, they did a sucky job of it. Instead of telling the truth, you decide to say, your hair looks terrific, dear. It was a good $120 spent at the stylist. So you told a little white lie. What harm did it do? Well, Kant says what it does is you just disrespected that person's dignity. Because when you lie to a person, even if your intent is to save their feelings, you are basically saying that they are not worthy of getting the truth. And by the way, every time you tell a lie, you harm that notion of the kingdom of ends. Because what you do whenever you tell any lie is you basically will lying. And to will lying is basically to will a total breakdown in communication. Because whenever another person speaks to you, what do we presuppose about other people's speech acts? And maybe this isn't smart.
Being relatively honest?
Yeah, that other people are going to be relatively honest with us. And most of us would like a world where honesty is what? Where honesty is a value that's respected by people. And this is why we get rightly irate whenever we hear pathological liars. Because basically, what are they saying about us? They're basically saying, you're too much of a piece of crap for me to give you the truth. Or you don't really matter anyway, so I will just lie, 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 and lie to you. This is a reason why politicians are universally reviled. Because many people are under the impression that they lie more than they tell the truth. And in some of their cases, that's probably true. But I'll behave myself. Now, I want to talk a little bit about stealing, too. Many of you have probably taken a Psych 101 class where you may have discussed this guy. How many of you ever discussed Lawrence Kohlberg and his theory of moral development? Good, good. Now, Kohlberg's own theory of moral development was very much like a Kantian one. Here's why. Because he argues that the highest stage of moral development is one where people act in accordance with principles. Where people religiously follow particular moral principles. And you're not doing it necessarily because you want to. You're doing it because you ought to. Because morality dictates it. You're also not doing it because of what you can get out of the bargain. Now, in order to test the stages that his subjects were at, he used a number of case studies. A famous case study that he uses, it's called Heinz Dilemma. I guess Heinz, and he's supposed to be a good German man. He's got a great name, Heinz. But anyway, Heinz is a man of not too great economic power. And his wife is very, very sick. Now, it comes to his attention that a simple country pharmacist has come up with a treatment for your wife's ailment. The problem is, Heinz doesn't have the what? He doesn't have the funds. So he kindly goes to this person and says, I don't have the money right now, but I will pay you in installments. I want my wife to live. Now guess what the guy says? No! It is my property. No money, no treatment. Now the question is, do you steal the drug? Do you steal the drug? Now in general, is stealing right or is it wrong? It's wrong because it basically disrespects another person's property. And we have these things called property rights in our Western ideology. Mr. Peters.
Under the categorical imperative, you would not steal the drug. But under a sector-based imperative, you would steal the drug because then you'd make it less profitable to hold drugs and treatments would be more accessible.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the long and the short of it here. The guy who basically says your wife doesn't matter, that what matters is my getting paid, he's done what? Now keep in mind, Heinz' wife has intrinsic worth. Now Kant would never call stealing what? He would never in a million years call stealing moral. In other words, if he steals the drug, he should keep in mind that he is not behaving morally, because he is treating the property owner as a mere means to an end. But it is understandable, depending upon what his reasoning is, why he might get that drug by any means necessary. And this is because if he views his wife as a person with intrinsic value, her life is what? Her life transcends the value of money. The problem is, in the real world, do we think that way? No, and perhaps if we did think in that ideal way, our whole damn economic system could collapse, for better or for worse. Because some people think that our economic system is not morally a good one. Because it actually doesn't treat people with dignity on one level. At least on one level, it doesn't treat people with dignity. Now, if you strictly, Mr. Peters is right, with a strict application of the categorical imperative, you'd have to say, no, you can't steal the drug. Now, of course, this would mean what would happen? Yeah, she'd die. Now, the reason I brought this one up is because in the real world, it's very difficult to apply any idealist moral theory, because there are always what? Because there are internal conflicts in this dilemma. And that's what Mr. Peters was getting at. There are internal conflicts in this dilemma. You'll notice if he strictly follows the categorical imperative, he won't steal. But if he also strictly follows it, his wife will die. Now, if he only wants his wife to live because his wife's living life gives his life pleasure or whatever, that would be a non-moral reason for keeping his wife alive. Guess what would be the only moral rationale for keeping her alive? Remember, her life matters not because of what she can do, but because of what she is.
She has human being intrinsic worth. Dignity.
Yeah, she has dignity. She possesses intrinsic worth. If I was only saving my wife's life because I would be greatly depressed if she were gone, I would be behaving selfishly and not morally. If I wanted to keep her around because I needed someone to do the cleaning and the laundry and so forth, I would not be acting on a moral level. Because human beings have intrinsic worth. In other words, the way that you get to your action is what matters here. Remember, your intent or your motives have to be moral ones. Mr. Hunter.
So under Kant's theory, because people with mental disabilities can't reason, they have no intrinsic worth.
Yes.
So in that situation, the moral thing under his words would just be to let them die.
Well, strictly speaking, and that's why the author of the text sort of makes that homework question point, that the way we would apply Kantian ethics today would actually broaden the field of beings that have intrinsic worth beyond what Kant says. In other words, we would say even if a person is not purely rational, they are still a person and ought to be afforded dignity. And by the way, some of us take it even further. Some people will say that animals ought to be afforded the same kind of consideration too, even if they're not what? Yeah, or rational. Yeah, even though they're not rational. In other words, rationality is a narrow way to define intrinsic worth, is what some people would say. Some people would say living things that are sentient ought to be granted, moral status. Now, some of us take it even further. Some of us think that living systems, and when I'm talking about a living system, I'm talking about this peculiar thing that people used to call Mother Earth. Some of us think that Mother Earth probably ought to be treated with the same kind of consideration. Because Mother Earth is comprised of what? Yeah, and a whole system of beings that ought to be given consideration. In other words, I like to think, and admittedly my politics and so forth are showing here, but I actually think that the living system that we call the biosphere ought to also be thought of in a similar way. And it's not just because we depend upon it, but because it has a value in and of itself. And not just in terms of what? Not just in terms of our sucking oil and coal out of it. Or not just in terms of our lumbering it. Or whatever resources you're talking about taking. In other words, it has some kind of intrinsic worth in and of itself. Even if it's not a sentient being. Even if it's not rational. But yeah, some of us extend this kind of thinking even further than Kant did. Is that okay, I hope?
Yep.
Now, one more thing I want to mention before we segue